Hello and welcome to a special referendum episode of The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, Australia votes no, a crushing defeat for the proponents of an Indigenous voice to Parliament, with 60% of the country deciding against changing the Constitution. Joining me on the panel tonight, Director of the Centre for Indigenous Training and former advisor to the Coalition, Wesley Aird. Thanks for being with us.
Hello.
Big weekend in Sydney.
Absolutely.
Yeah. ABC Voice correspondent and co-host of The Drum, Dan Borscher, is in.
Good to be with you.
Thanks for being here, Dan. In Lismore tonight, General Manager of the Courier Mail newspaper, Naomi Moran, is here. Nice to meet you, Naomi. In Brisbane, Professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Divinity, Anne Patel-Gray. Lovely to meet you, Anne.
Pleasure to be here.
And joining us from Darwin, wonderful to see journalist and writer Ben Abadangelo. Hi, Ben. Thanks for making the time.
Thanks, Alan.
And you can join us online using the hashtag #TheDrum, and we live stream on Facebook. Well, last night was a resounding defeat of a years-long push by Aboriginal leaders to recognise the first people of Australia in the Constitution through a voice to Parliament. It is hard to overstate the scale of the defeat. 60% of Australians rejected the proposal, with every state and territory voting no except the ACT. The Prime Minister says the failed referendum won't define or divide the country, but prominent Indigenous leader Marcia Langton disagrees, labelling it the death knell to the reconciliation movement. Here's a little of how last night unfolded.
While tonight's result is not one that I had hoped for, I absolutely respect the decision of the Australian people and the democratic process that has delivered it.
I think there's a real arrogance in the way in which the Prime Minister's approached his discussion with the Australian people. Even tonight in his speech you can hear the words almost of contempt for the Australian people dripping from what he's saying.
We have seen a disgusting no campaign, a campaign that has been dishonest, that has lied to the Australian people, and I'm sure that'll come out in the analysis. I'm sure that history will reflect poorly on Peter Dutton.
This was an awful campaign that was run by both the Prime Minister and the Yes campaign. At no stage did they put forward a compelling case as to why an advisory body should be entrenched in the Constitution. Instead, the whole campaign was based on emotion.
This moment of disagreement does not define us, and it will not divide us. We are not yes voters or no voters. We are all Australians.
He was taking the country to a point of division, and I just don't think strong leaders do that.
The most critical component here was a refusal to negotiate and a refusal to try and compromise to get a product which could have captured the centre ground, and I think that is my diagnosis.
Not surprised, given the country hasn't been taken on a journey and that the referendum ultimately was a bad idea in the first place.
What needs to happen now, and I say this for us mob, is to use this as an opportunity to maybe come up with a different strategy when it comes to dealing with the violence of settler colonialism in this place. And maybe retire hope.
It's very clear that reconciliation is dead. A majority of Australians have said no to an invitation from Indigenous Australia with a minimal proposition to give us a bare say in matters that affect our lives.
We are absolutely not a racist country. We are one of the, if not the greatest nation on the face of the earth.
We will continue to write the next chapter in that great Australian story, and we will write it together, and reconciliation must be a part of that chapter.
I want to talk to the panel initially about how they are feeling as Indigenous leaders in this country tonight, starting with you, Anne Patel-Gray. You were talking about if it's a no, we're condemning the nation to hell. That was your fear some months ago. How do you feel tonight?
Oh, I feel devastated. I mean, I feel for my countrymen and women across this nation. You know, the vote was an overwhelming rejection of us as a people. And, you know, we've had since the 90s the whole process of reconciliation. So, you know, you can virtually say reconciliation's dead in the water as a result of this, because that rejection has re-traumatised our people, has cut to the core of their humanity. And, you know, once again, it states to us as a nation that we have no value and worth in this country. So, you know, there's a lot of conversations that need to happen, and how we go forward is open for question. But also, you know, we Aboriginal people, we're resilient people, and our resilience will continue to shine through. And we'll go away and lick our wounds and mourn and grieve a bit, but we'll come back, hopefully, even stronger.
And clarify for me, Anne, the mourning and the grief and the feeling of rejection was around, a lot of people saw it as a clinical question about a mechanism, right, about a voice, but it was also about recognition of First Nations people. Is that what you're referencing? Yeah, recognising us as First Nations people, recognising the poverty that we're confined to, how we're disenfranchised in this country, our poor health, our lack of access to good education. These were all the questions that were a part of the referendum, and the reason that we encourage people to vote yes, because it was giving us a voice. We've had successive governments in this country fail to deliver in closing the gap on our health, education, prosperity, and every other way. High incarcerations, high mortality rates. And last night was, hey, you know, I don't know if I really care about what's happening in your world. I mean, the media, the commercial media even stated that in regards to where people are today in their own personal lives, that we were lucky if we rated number 16 on their radar. So what does that say about our nation and, you know, the respect that should be given to us, or even the recognition that somehow we in this country need to look at our history, understand our history and what has happened in our history. And to me, the no vote was a resounding reflection of the lack of knowledge about that history and their ignorance. Now, in Lismore tonight, Naomi Moran, you are the General Manager of the Courier Mail newspaper, which is the largest Indigenous newspaper in the country. So you would talk to so many people in so many communities, a whole range of ages. What are you hearing in response to this from community?
Yeah, and look, and I guess in the past, you know, I guess overnight, in terms of how our communities around the nation, you know, are feeling, there's obviously a mixed response, because there's been a mixed response to how this is received by non-Indigenous Australia, but certainly by our own people and our own communities around the country. Perhaps I can speak on the lead up to the vote and just how diverse the conversations were. And, you know, I don't want to spend too much time talking about the obvious, which is how that has led to perhaps the aggression around it from certain groups that had decided to vote no, you know, but also in response to that aggression, perhaps some of that more kind of passionate response, I guess, from groups of people who are very much about the yes and campaign for the yes. And I think what we've seen day in and day out across our news desk, what we've written in articles, what we've presented in First Nations media, I feel has been a very healthy opportunity for people to have conversations on both sides.
And that's speaking as a journalist representing a multilingual, multicultural First Nations community across the country. What about you? I mean, you have been talking about that you were going to fortify yourself. You were going to steel yourself for an answer that maybe you personally didn't want to hear. Did that work, or have you been laid low by it?
Myself personally.
That's it.
I think, look, I've been really, transparent in that my position on this as an individual is certainly my own. That's based on my story. That's based on my lived experience as a blackfella. I wonder if that's been the experience of countless others in this nation on the journey towards their decision. And I wonder if, once we start to unpack the results of this, whether it tells us that it is based on people taking a really deep look at who they are, doing that self-reflection in the lead up. As was mentioned before, the education process, the knowledge, the connections with our communities around the nation, the understanding on how this nation is positioning itself in its maturity to even understand and navigate what this potentially could have meant for our country. I think for me is also understanding my role in First Nations media and the role of First Nations media is that we've long carried the voices of our people around the country. And so for us to wake up today after this result, we acknowledge what our cultural responsibilities are, that we continue to carry the voices of our people now into the next generations. I'd like to think that for the large majority of people in this country that have made this journey, that have made this about their egos, about self-promotion, about being right or being wrong, I'd like to think that they now can wake up with some kind of idea of what their accountability and responsibility is now moving forward. What does that look like?
We have two people I suspect voted no. I assume voted no. You've had real concerns, Ben, about the proposal for the voice, and you've expressed those in Dan's Four Corners. You spoke very eloquently about that. And we're also going to hear from Wesley Ed, who had real concerns about the proposal. But Ben, I'm interested to hear, despite the fact that you weren't a proponent of the voice, how you, as a First Nations man, are feeling tonight, right?
I mean, I carry a duality of feelings. I hold the hurt and the harm of the community that have invested so much time and energy and hope and aspiration into this proposal. And then at the same time, I'm warmed by the rage that I'm seeing from grassroots blackfellas across the country. My position on this is that I very much feel as though that this was an inevitable outcome of a almost 2-decade-long impasse. And importantly, in the immediate aftermath, I think it's more important to recognise that despite what was on the ballot box, it's always been the character of the colony that is on trial throughout this referendum process. It's not necessarily about blackfellas, it's more so about, I suppose, the ideas that this country wraps itself up on. It put the notion that this is, a place of the fair go, that this nation is one of decent people, that it is a successful multicultural society. That's what's been on trial over the course of the last 18 months plus. And I suppose to round out the start of this conversation is, for me, I live around the corner from Dondale, where 10-year-olds are locked up in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. Australia was never going to miss the opportunity or knock back the invitation to show itself for who it is. And I think that's really important for us to centre the gaze on that over the course of the next couple of weeks, because behind that liberal democracy has always been an incredibly fascist face.
You're agreeing with that, Anne?
Yes, totally.
Let me turn to Wesley. Your views on that?
Ellen, I think we've heard a lot of misinformation throughout the whole campaign, and because we didn't have the detail, and because it was pitched as if it was Indigenous versus the rest, often, I think it created a bit of an existential crisis where on the one hand people are saying, is the vote about the place for Indigenous people in Australia? as prior occupants? Is it about recognition? But it's a referendum. It's actually a bill to alter the Constitution. So there are, I think, millions of Australians that actually voted on the words of the Constitution alteration bill rather than on some sort of do I recognise prior occupation of Australia.
But that was the question. I mean, I went into the little ballot booth with a little pencil yesterday.
Yeah,
I'm
no,
sure
I was
that was
there
the
as
question.
well. But when you read the Constitution alteration bill, and then
how many Australians do you reckon read the Constitution alteration bill? I mean, was that the issue?
I would say not enough, because that's what actually happens if it goes through, if it's successful. That's the thing that the judges will be looking at if it ever goes to court.
And you're going to bring some optimism and some deep political analysis to what you think are the issues, technical issues about why this went wrong, which probably stands in contrast to what some of the others are saying about the structural nature of the vote. But how do you feel despite today?
I don't take any pleasure in the result, and I don't take any pleasure in the campaign and the way it went from both sides, because it put a pretty ugly spotlight on Indigenous Australia.
Is your community across Australia, range of communities, in a worse spot now than they were before they started?
No, I don't think so. I think that throughout this whole thing, we have had Indigenous agencies continue to deliver services to people that are doing it tough, and that is absolutely critical. I think that I actually think we're possibly worse off because we've had such a focus on the campaign that maybe some people have dropped the ball around coming up with new solutions, and we've waited for 18 months. So I don't know what's going to happen next.
But you're not having a personal emotional reaction to this vote, because this was a hell of a vote, right? They still haven't counted it all. 70%,
no,
77.6%, I think, Dan, has been counted, and it's looking, 60% to 40%.
But it's not surprising. I think that's the thing, is that all of the polls said that this is how it was likely going to go. So I think I've been expecting this whilst I've been watching the polls over the last few weeks. And so I wasn't shocked last night.
Yeah, and I guess the question we need to start to try and unpack, Dan, is why? Why is this vote as it is? And as Ben says, to try and sit with the starkness of the result, and not let narratives quickly develop about what's happened and why. I mean, what's your analysis? You've been on this whole journey.
I think we've just heard the why from this panel. I think when Anne talks about that overwhelming sense of rejection, of not having a grasp of our collective history as Australians, about the things that have happened and the impacts that had then and how they resonate now. I think when Naomi talks about that accountability, that responsibility for all of us to understand and be a part of that story. When Ben talks about that duality and that the hurt and pain and that warming of the rage, but also that question about character, then is exactly what Wesley is talking about the spotlight that this put on what it means to be an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person right now. And what I found really interesting this year is my role has come down to one line that Naomi said, the cultural responsibility to carry our voices. So when I accepted this, I had to be very conscious to step out of a political perspective and not get into that. I had to create this space always for people of all walks of life, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, to share their views however they may be. And it's why, with the exception of Anne, who I've only just met tonight, I've had long conversations with everyone that is on this panel and so many others from a range of views and perspectives. And it's why last night in the coverage, after the coverage, I went to bed and I had about 100 text messages that I couldn't open. I was emotionally drained from feeling like carrying that tension, not because of the outcome, but because of the weight of this moment for all of us, regardless of the outcome. This morning I went through those, and they cover the complete spectrum of views. Yes, no, progressive, no, undecided, unsure. The red thread that ran through those was the worry about what this says about who we are And so today we are sitting with that sense of unease, of not really knowing, what does this say about us? And I think I've felt today at times kind of overwhelmed by thinking about that very question of what does this mean and what is the story we are going to tell ourselves. And of course we are going to hear many in the days ahead. Parliament, as you mentioned, is about to sit. There will be all sorts of writing of this history. I think we need the time and space to really think about that.
Well, overnight, some Indigenous leaders who campaigned for the yes vote called for a week of silence to grieve and reflect on the outcome. The statement said Indigenous community will reconvene soon to, quote, carefully consider our path forward.
This is a bitter irony, that people who have only been on this continent for 235 years would refuse to recognise those whose home this land has been for 60,000 and more years is beyond reason. We will not rest long. Pack up the Uluru Statement from the heart, fly our flags low, talk not of recognition and reconciliation, only of justice and the rights of our people in our own country. We are calling a week of silence from tonight to grieve this outcome and reflect on its meaning and significance. We will not be commenting further on the result at this time.
To be clear, Ben, no statement in this country represents every Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander person, and that certainly doesn't either. What do you say to the idea of having called for a voice? Well, you didn't, but there was a call for a voice, that there's now people imploring silence.
I mean, my power has never come from, and many other blackfellas, from acceptance or rejection with the colony. That's never been a motivating factor for how I respond as an Indigenous person. I empathise wholeheartedly with the many wonderful people that are actually attached to the campaign and who I have a deep reverence for, and also that this has been a long sprint from them. I think there's a couple of points though that I want to touch on. One, towards the back end of the vote, there were a lot of moments where, and I wasn't sure if it was gamesmanship from the campaign or whether it was just a truth, but the fact that a lot of the campaigners continued to say that there was no plan B and that this was our grand final and this was our one shot. And I think this moment is potentially reflective of that. But the second reason why I think, we need to have blackfellas a part of the discourse in this moment is that if we don't, then we know what's going to happen. The void is going to be filled by the same sympathisers who are going to, in the post-mortem reflections, continue to tie ourselves in more knots when all of the evidence in front of us is really clear. I think we just need to lean into it, to hold the gaze on what's in front of us and, have those really considered, mature dialogues and conversations. And, as an Aboriginal person myself, I'm not here to talk about the campaign itself. I think there'll be time for that in due course, but I'm looking forward to hearing from blackfellas around the country over the coming days and in the coming weeks. Yeah,
I mean, you talked to Ben, Dan, for the Four Corners special, and he was sort of using that bushfire analogy, wasn't he, about, he thought that this result would come and he had a certain optimism in that, it would provide an opportunity to start again.
Yeah. I mean, that was such an interesting analogy because we were sitting on Yolngu country there at a place where bushfire, when it comes through, it is the leveller and wipes everything out before that regrowth. And this is the kind of cycle that is managed there by the rangers and has been managed by traditional custodians for a very long time. It's a way of kind of managing that land. And Ben was using this analogy of this being the reckoning, that comes through and then the green shoots kind of emerge from that. And I then put that to Bunaba woman June Oscar, who's the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner, who said, well, that's a very interesting analogy, and I'm paraphrasing, but said that, there comes kind of trauma with that if that's the way, the reckoning, then there is a cost to that, really begging the question of what is that cost and how do you reconcile if that's the way to get to the outcome, then what does the outcome look like? And I think that's the thing that I thought about a bit afterwards, but I haven't had a chance to ask you about that, about how you feel about that, because you would have seen that in the episode.
Yeah, and on that, I mean, I take no great joy in talking about harm and pain and trauma. But at the same time, I hold the duality of thought that I'm somewhat pleased that this moment comes in 2023 and not 2038. I mean, we've spent a couple of decades tending to conservative acceptance. We've gone engaged in a process that effectively has minimised our rights and almost revised them to the point where we're saying it's our right to be heard. It's our right to be self-determining. It isn't our right to be advising decision makers, it is our right to be the decision makers. So I'm optimistic about blackfellas in this moment of disillusionment, of us turning back to one another and preferencing our own ways of knowing, being and doing, because we shouldn't be looking towards the rest of the place for recognition. We should be looking within and holding that tension and holding that belief in one another, holding that love, holding that beauty, because that's where our strategies are born out of, our most successful ones. And, you know, I believe that over the next months, over the next couple of years, that this will be a nucleus for a new era of strategy, of movement building, of vitality.
Wes?
Ellen, I want to go back to that statement that we had heard an excerpt from, calling for the week of silence. It's going to be a really historically important document, and part of it it divides Australia by the newcomers, you know, as opposed to Indigenous people. And I think, I mean, for me, I like to think that we're all Australian, and I think that might need to be part of our sort of reflection over the next week. You know, are we really two different parts of Australia? And can we focus on what brings us together and where we overlap and where we work together, where we, you know, have fun together? Or is it really just so adversarial?
Did you read that as adversarial?
I've got to jump in here,
yeah,
if that's all right. Look, you know, we're overlooking history and we're overlooking current policies and that exist in this country. We are a divided country. From 1788, this government constituted legislations and policies directed at the First Nations people. And that is still the case today. I don't know how you can sit there and say we're one nation when the government set policies distinctly on the base of race. And that is for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. There is no unity when you talk about we're not being treated fairly and where one racial group is being legislated over and one racial group is being incarcerated at a higher rate, when one racial group has as low expectations of getting educated and getting better health services. I mean, how can you talk about unity when it doesn't exist? You know, we live in a country that is a colonial history that is structured to benefit the majority and exclude and marginalise the minority, which is the First Nations people. And if we look at the campaign, and particularly the social media campaign that was run in this country, some of the statements that were made by no campaigners, that one, we Aboriginal people get free houses from the government, we get free cars, we get too much money. Well, tell me where I can go and collect my free house and my free car. Because I'm missing out, mate. I've been duped somewhere along the way if this is what we're entitled to. So, you know, we've got to bring some truth into this conversation and stop blowing smoke and presenting a world that is not our reality.
Naomi, can I turn to you? Thinking about those things that have just been said there by Anne, right? The free cars, all this nonsense, all this misinformation. We have talked a lot about why this vote went the way it did. Was it city versus region, education, income levels? One element we never want to talk about is the R word, is race. What role did race have in this in terms of attitudes to Indigenous Australians, who Noel Pearson has called the most unloved people in Australia?
Yeah, look, I've spoken a bit about the idea that Australia as we know it today has never known a time where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as First Nations of this country have been in full control of their own affairs. And that creates a fear in this country that then breeds or regurgitates racism that has existed in this country since colonisation. We only have to see it when we read the comments section. We only have to hear it when we're, listening to conversations passing by on public transport. We experience it directly as blackfellas in this country. So that fear that this nation has of a time that they've never known, yet we know that, our ancestors knew that. We carry that in our Black DNA. I can't help but feel that that's been a big contributing factor to not just how people have received this and voted, but also their inability to have respectful and mature conversations, to pick this apart, whether you were for the vote or not for the vote, but to actually sit down and unpack this in a respectful way that should acknowledge a 235-year history of whatever people are feeling or thought that the reconciliation process was for them. I would have hoped that there would have been a better story to tell in the lead up to this outcome, but there's not. And as a black fella, I can say that because of my experiences throughout this process, and certainly working in Indigenous media. Like I said before, the stuff that comes across our desks every single day, the letters by anonymous people who are too gutless to write their names on a racist letter that comes in our mailboxes every day and says the most horrible things about Black people in this country, but it's addressed to me. And I come from a generation where I'm now carrying the stories of those that have come before me that have experienced that. My grandfather was taken away at 9 years old and sent to Kinchela Boys Home and didn't return home until he was 19. And the story of what happened to him and thousands of our young boys that left their communities as young, innocent boys and returned as traumatized men. We cannot continue accepting the narrative that Australia is not a racist country, that there are people in this country that feed it because it comes from generations that are still here that haven't taken that accountability and responsibility to make it right for decades and decades in this country. So I want to acknowledge that, yes, going into this, the journey over the past few years and certainly the past few weeks and months, we have to acknowledge that as mob, in the back of our minds, we always knew there was a possibility that this was actually going to create perhaps more trauma and pain and emotional and cultural and spiritual and mental turmoil for our people than it has the rest of the nation. The rest of the nation has woken up today and some of them have said, well, I told you so, and they've gotten on with their Sunday activities. But for our country, for our people in this country, we've woken up, and for some of us, myself included, I've actively chosen not to scroll. I've actively chosen not to click on links. I've actively chosen not to look at the hundreds of messages and inboxes that have been sent, because I feel myself personally, over the next coming days and weeks, and without publicly stating it, that I will take the time to process just how enormous this has been for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country. And we say this time and time again, our blackness is not something that we can just wash off every night so that we can have a good night's sleep. Our blackness is not something that we can strip ourselves off and put on a new t-shirt the next day and not consider who we are as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country. And one thing that I'm really determined to make sure that I not only empower myself to do, but have the conversations and certainly let those that are, you know, young and now growing up and on that journey to being so sure of themselves as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people. While this could have been such a defining moment for our nation, I will not let this outcome define me as a Black woman and define me in the work that I do every single day and have been doing over the past 25 years to carry the voices of our people in this country through Indigenous media.
Thank you. So well said.
Wow.
So well said. Dan, the political answer, which we'll start to hear tomorrow, so we're in this little interregnum on a Sunday night where we get to think before Parliament resumes and all
the rest of the noise.
Yeah, the noise starts, right? The political answer is the Australian people always get it right. And the press release, we were texting each other earlier from Anastasia Palaszczuk, I think you referred it to us, The Australian people have spoken. Their voice tells me they're not ready, not yet. I respect that. They never get it wrong. What do we do with that? Not so much respecting it, but the notion that this is not wrong.
It's a simple comment to a much more complicated question. So that, of course, is what politicians of all stripes have said, and there is an electoral reason for that. There is a reason about not undermining our democratic system, about not saying that there are questions there. The challenge, I think, around that statement is it does not take into account what led to that decision, and there will be months, actually there will be years and decades of consideration over what happened yesterday and the year that led up to that. From where I've been sitting and the conversations that I've been having, we cannot discount the impact of a ruthlessly simple campaign from the no side that found a level of cut through that most campaigns haven't, and that is, of course, if you don't know, vote no, that this is divisive and will divide our country. In addition to that, that statement does not capture the complexity of misinformation, of disinformation, some of which we've canvassed now, and much of it has been talked about throughout this year and will be again in the weeks and months ahead. And it also doesn't begin to look at what social media's impact has been on this. In the roles, Ellen, that you and I are in, and actually others in our panel as well in the media sector, we are bound by really clear rules and guidelines about what we can say, what we can broadcast, and the consequences that may flow, the legal structures around that. There seems to be this gaping void on social media about how that is governed and regulated, and all of us will get different information on our social media based on algorithms of which we don't have control over and we don't know, based on what we've clicked, what we've liked, all a whole range of other factors. So all of that will play into this. There will also, of course, be a very serious question about some of the media coverage throughout this year and the impact that has had to get to that answer.
Dan, there is no federal law restricting lies in political ads.
No.
And ACT introduced one, I think, 2022?
Yeah, just very recently.
Very recently.
Yeah.
So we've got this opportunity now to look back on the campaigns and go, let's not do that again.
Can I ask you, sorry, Ellen, I don't want to...
No, go for it.
What do you think that conversation needs to be, and what are the parameters that we need to start considering? Because this is a really interesting point, and I've had this conversation throughout this year. What might be a lie to one person might be another person's perspective, and if they are, as former Prime Minister said, a cigarette paper apart, then there is an area of grey there, depending on perspective, isn't there?
Well, we had the introduction of the misinformation piece from the federal government in the middle of the campaign. We've now got the first referendum in the era of social media, iPhones, smartphones. And the other thing is that everybody's a publisher. They've got this device in their pocket and they can put their horrible or positive messages out without even thinking about it and thinking that they don't have to bear accountability. But as you would all know, as journalists and as stewards of the national conversation, it really ought to be carefully considered, because the words that you publish have real consequences for people's lives.
To what extent, though, was that utilised or not repudiated by the No campaign? Those sorts of things. As Anne was saying before, free cars, free houses, your children won't get... Specific, Jason Yatsen-Lee, Chinese-Australian New South Wales MP, said there's messages going to Chinese community saying your kids won't be able to get into selective schools because there'll be places reserved for Indigenous kids. So these are focused... Did we see enough of the No campaign saying that is not true, just ignore that, and these are the reasons we think you should vote no?
I had nothing to do with the campaigns.
But from what you observed.
I think I saw a lot of misinformation from both sides.
No. Correcting
in terms of calling it out. I don't think that the No campaign called out those sorts of things when in instances that I was told and heard about them. I don't think that the No campaign did that in those instances. I don't think the Yes campaign publicly called that out either. I think there were gaps in what people were saying because of the perhaps different campaign strategies. Those points that you make, of course, are all rubbish and were put out there to try and muddy the waters, to make this about anything except what was on the ballot. But then a point about this is divisive and will divide Australia. There will be arguments that is on one hand misinformation. There will be other arguments on the other hand from people that will say, well, that is fair. There is also a question in the middle there about, when you're saying that, how much does that create that sense of division, if you will?
And a broader conversation, which we don't have time for tonight, which is that racism is not necessarily represented, well, it is, but it's not exclusively represented by somebody in a white cape with a burning cross. If you're saying that Aboriginal people have all these advantages when they clearly don't, if you're spreading lies about going to the bed, that is racism, right?
Because what other purpose does that have when you hear about the emails and the letters that
that's racism.
Naomi gets, that it is all...
Those lies are racist.
Absolutely.
One of the things that we need to look at is the commercial TVs, in particular morning shows. It's been a long time since I've seen unbiased reporting. And I must say, in this campaign, what I saw was absolute biases that were coming through people's thoughts, their opinions, and how they were giving far more airtime to the No campaign than anybody else. And what I come down to is we wouldn't have had the results we had if we had educated our nation, our citizens, because then you come to a referendum informed, educated and making better decisions. And it's harder to be mischievous and be deceitful and throw lies out there if you've got an educated nation. Total difference could have come out of this had we looked at how we run the campaign, and perhaps going forward, the government can look at a priority as to how we educate our nation and make Indigenous education a core curriculum and mandatory in schools, universities and everywhere else across this country.
And as part of the wash-up of the ABC, rightly, and all the other media will have their coverage reviewed. And certainly there's a perception that yes got more or no got more, and that will all come out as well. So where to now? The late Yolngu leader, Yunupingu, spent a lifetime trying to make real change to address Aboriginal disadvantage. Bob Hawke, you remember, promised a treaty with First Nations Australians in 1988, never delivered on it. In the decades since, the emphasis has been on reconciliation. Here's what Yunupingu said in 2008 about his frustrations with the reconciliation movement.
Treaty has become reconciliation. There is all this talk about nothing. I am seeing now that too much of the past is for nothing. I've walked the corridors of power, I've negotiated and cajoled and praised and begged prime ministers and ministers, and at times success has seemed so close, yet it always slips away. It frustrates me and drives me crazy. At night it is like a splinter in my mind. The solutions to the future, simple though I thought they were, have become harder and harder to grasp.
Ben Abadangelo, Marcia Langton said reconciliation is dead, it's over with. Do you agree?
100%, yeah. And it's really healthy. I think we've given it too much airtime, and I'm very wary of those that are saying that we should maintain reconciliation, because fundamentally at the heart of it is one-way compromises. It is nothing more than a strategy to further entrench, a colonial apparatus and system, and to dehumanise blackfellas.
Literally, what is it? If you say, if what Yunupingu was saying was there was a movement for treaty and that failed and it morphed into reconciliation with a capital R, Australians will know that term, whether they know it from their sacraments or they know it from this debate. What did it mean in a political sense for you?
A licence for settlers to do more harm.
Robert Tickner brought the reconciliation agenda to the table, and as a process of bringing about what he determined justice. Now, from a theological perspective and from a Christian perspective, there can be no reconciliation unless those that have the perpetrator, one, acknowledges they've done wrong, and two, repents of that wrong, and three, then pays reparations and delivers justice in order that we can be reconciled. So, to jump from a history of injustices to, we're reconciled, is a joke. What happened to every step in the middle?
Did it die yesterday, do you think, Anne? Is that what you're saying?
Look, reconciliation's been around a while, and I suppose the culmination of the referendum has put it to bed. It has buried it. So yes, it's dead in the water now in Australia.
I find that astounding coming from you as a Christian person. The idea that you must always strive to reconcile, even if, turn the other cheek. Why do you say that the circumstances do not allow for this reconciliation?
Because there's no justice. Reconciliation is bound on or based on the perpetrator acknowledging their wrong. This country's not prepared to do this. And then it is not prepared to pay reparations, to set right the injustices and to give justice. And you cannot be reconciled if you do not do those steps. This country hasn't done those steps. Now, the referendum was an opportunity to take a small step in reconciliation, which was a logical step towards justice. Well, that didn't happen. So how can we continue to talk about reconciliation without justice?
Wesley?
It came out of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody in 1991. That's where the term reconciliation comes from. I think recommendation 339.
Still not implemented along with the other.
A long time ago, 30 years ago, it's had a lot of airtime. But sometimes I actually wonder if I was asked to define it, to write it down, I don't know what I'd write. So many companies, government departments have got reconciliation action plans, but I'm not quite sure where the end is or how will we ever know when we're reconciled. Kevin Rudd's apology to the Stolen Generations in his early days was significant, but it was just a statement, and then people were wondering, well, what next? So yeah, it is a very tricky sort of philosophical thing to grapple with.
What I'm hearing here is I think what many grapple with when it comes to reconciliation, particularly in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community or parts of it, that it means one thing to politicians and to businesses and to structures, as it does to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I think that grab that you played there from that incredible essay by Yunupingu in 2008 goes to that point that what began as a call for treaty, of a really clear coming together and well, maybe reconciling is not the right word, but coming together to navigate a series of challenges and questions, then morphed into reconciliation, which is what we heard yesterday from a number of politicians saying this does not end reconciliation, because that is what politicians want there to be the focus on, or that is what that is the way that the political structures understand the mechanism to step forward. And I think this is going to be a real question, particularly when we've heard what we just heard from Anne and Ben and Wesley, three really powerful perspectives on this one word, in addition to what we heard from Professor Marcia Langton overnight.
And it's all well and good for politicians of all stripes to say reconciliation must continue, but if the other party won't come to the table to reconcile, then something has to change in the way in which Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people deal with one another in power structures in this country. And reconciliation is sounding like it will not be the way. You're nodding.
And what I heard from Anne just then is, what do Aboriginal people have to reconcile? What is that side of this conversation? Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, is that the question here? That it's not for Indigenous people to do the reconciling?
No, it was a perfect opportunity. The referendum was a perfect opportunity for this nation to take that step closer towards reconciliation by giving us recognition within the Constitution and also giving us a voice. And the voice doesn't take us far enough, but it's a step towards being heard and being consulted. But yes, I mean, for so long, Aboriginal Nation has stated that reconciliation, as it's defined by government, is to appease the consciousness of white Australia. It is not about justice for First Nations people. And quite often they say, you know, that they want to sugarcoat injustices to make it palatable for us to swallow. So, you know, these are some of the hard issues and conversations that this country must have.
Okay, let's go to Naomi and to Ben, and then we'll come to our conclusion tonight. When Yunupingu says, Naomi, that he's negotiated, he's cajoled, he's praised, he's begged, right? That's a form of activism we know about, a polite activism, right? Reconciliation with a capital R. Kind faces, right? Are we looking at a new era of activism and advocacy that takes a different approach to the one he described there?
Yeah, and look, just on the back of, you know, that conversation about reconciliation, I'm a really visual person, and I couldn't help but visualise in this very moment, you know, just that revolving door that nobody likes to go through for fear of getting stuck, and then what? And I feel like this is exactly, you know, what's happened. I don't agree that reconciliation is dead. I agree. I feel like I can actively work in my community, work for an organisation, you know, work on other initiatives and projects where I can actually really see and feel that, you know, at a local level, more in our communities, that there is absolutely a strong willingness to support reconciliation. What that word means, and maybe the definition of it and how it's associated with other words, perhaps, is what we need to consider, so that we can actually start to see what is happening in our communities at local levels and more intimately to I guess, give us a bit of faith and know that moving forward, we're still doing the work, and we know that we actively have groups of people and allies that are supporting us to do that. And perhaps now we need to take a look at what we're doing at a local level and supporting that. And I can only say that because I've only ever grown up on country. I've only, you know, ever worked for an independent organisation that just so happens to be proudly based here on Bundjalung country. And so the work that we do in our community is really strong, and the amount of people that walk into our organisations with a willingness to listen, that deep listening and to understand, that's what I can see, and that's what I know will continue to happen. So again, back to what my cultural responsibility is making sure that I'm harnessing and support that. Now tie that in with what you've just asked me to speak on, that's the activism.
Okay. That is activism. I'm only cutting you short because we're short on time. Ben, I want to hear when you say it all burns out and the green shoots emerge, what sort of advocacy and activism do you imagine if it's not the one that cajoles, begs and praises?
Yeah, and I just want to acknowledge, I think, Naomi's work and the woman that she is, and it's so brilliant to listen to her. But, you know, reconciliation is the most palatable of our words. You know, there's plenty of others. There's reckoning, there's redistribution, there's retribution, there's rights. There's a whole myriad of our words that are more, I think, succinct to what we're after. But what I'm interested in is a peaceful coexistence. But that can only occur when Indigenous people are able to enact, you know, our rights and our, you know, political autonomy, to have independence over our futures, to be in the driver's seat and not consistently through reconciliation positioned as roadkill. So I think the tone moving forward will be very different. It'll be privileging our ways of knowing, being and doing. And fortunately, I think we're going to say goodbye to the cajoling and, you know, trying to massage and manoeuvre with a group of people that have no humanity and systems that fundamentally exist and thrive off the ongoing dehumanisation of those that were born out of these living lands and waters.
For many Indigenous Australians, hoping the referendum would succeed now is understandably a painful time. And while it might be difficult to find reasons for hope, last night advocate for Indigenous children Catherine Little had this to say.
My final thoughts actually go to mob who are hurting right now, and what I want to say is you're going to be okay. We will get through this. You're going to come back stronger. We will continue to look for those solutions. We will continue to push. You're going to be okay. We got you.
Final words from you tonight, Anne. Yeah, you're working in the world of healing and of faith. Some final words from you.
Look, you know, I say to my mob out there, you know, our people, take comfort that the ancestors are with you, that they give us strength to continue in our struggle, and that we take courage and build on our resilience to continue the fight for justice. Be with us, we're with one another, and may the Creator be with you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for those final words tonight, and that is all we have time for. Thank you to our panel, for Wesley Aird. Thank you for coming in again. Dan Borsha, what an extraordinary time you've had.
It's been a year.
Yeah. Naomi Moran, thank you so much for being with us. Anne Patel-Gray in Brisbane, thanks for your time. And Ben Abbott-Angelo in Darwin, wonderful to see your face and hear your thoughts in this extraordinary conversation tonight, very special conversation. I'll be back with you tomorrow. Have a very good evening. Good night to you.